I heard it through the bathroom wall. My daughter and her husband didn't know I was still inside. I'd come downstairs to get my reading glasses and stopped to use the powder room off the hallway, the one with the thin walls and the noisy pipes. They were in the kitchen, maybe 10 feet away, and his voice carried the way it always did when he wasn't trying to be quiet. "She's going to be here forever, isn't she?" It wasn't a question. My daughter said something I couldn't make out. Then he said, "I didn't sign up for a third person in this house. I married you, not your mother." I stood very still with my hand on the towel rack. The faucet was still dripping. I hadn't turned it off all the way. "She has nowhere else to go," my daughter said, and something in the way she said it, not warmly, not as a defense, just as a fact, like explaining why you keep a piece of furniture you don't really like. That was the part that settled into my chest and stayed. I turned off the faucet. I dried my hands. I walked back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in what they called the guest room, though I had been living in it for 11 months. The quilt was one I'd brought from my own house, the house I sold when my husband, Ray, passed. Pale yellow squares with white stitching. I'd had it for 30 years. I pressed my palm flat against it and just breathed. I had moved here because my daughter asked me to. Not begged, not pleaded, but asked in that practical way she had. "It makes sense, Mum. The house is too big for you alone, and we have the room." I told myself it was temporary. 6 months, maybe a year, until I figured out the next thing. I'd been telling myself that for almost a year now, and I hadn't figured out a single thing, because I'd stopped looking. I was 68 years old, and I was sleeping under my own quilt in my daughter's guest room while my son-in-law explained to my daughter that I was not what he had agreed to. I did not sleep much that night. In the morning, I made coffee before anyone else was up. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the conversation had happened, and I drank it slowly. The house was quiet except for the furnace cycling on and the sound of the neighbor's dog barking at something on the other side of the fence. I had a list in my head that I'd been ignoring. Things I hadn't done since Ray died, since I sold the house, since I moved into this room with my yellow quilt and my reading glasses and my careful, shrinking life. I hadn't opened my own bank account since I'd closed the joint one. I hadn't looked at my RRSP statements in 8 months. I hadn't spoken to a lawyer about the small amount Ray had left, which I'd tucked into a savings account and not touched, because touching it felt like deciding something. That morning, I got out a notepad and wrote 3 things on it: bank, lawyer, apartment. I folded it and put it in my cardigan pocket. My daughter came downstairs at 7:15, hair still damp, already in her work clothes. She poured coffee without looking at me and said, "Sleep okay?" "Fine," I said. She nodded and scrolled through her phone. We sat together in the kitchen for 11 minutes. I watched the clock, and she didn't ask me anything else. After she left, I called my friend Paulette. We'd known each other since our children were in elementary school together. 30 years of coffee and phone calls and the occasional hard conversation. She answered on the second ring. "I need to find an apartment," I said. A pause. "Okay. What happened?" I told her. Not dramatically, not in pieces. The whole thing, start to finish, while I stood at the window watching the neighbor's dog run circles in his yard. "You've been there almost a year," she said when I finished. 11 months. She knows you heard. "No." Another pause. "You're sure you want to move?" "I'm sure I'd been not moving for 11 months, I said. "That's what I'm sure of. Paulette came over that afternoon. She didn't ask permission. That wasn't her way. She knocked twice and let herself in, which she'd been doing since 1994, and we sat at the kitchen table with my notepad between us and started making calls. There were more options than I'd expected. A seniors building on the north end of the city where a unit was coming available. An independent living complex near the university with a good bus route and a small grocery within walking distance. A newer building downtown that allowed pets, though I didn't have a pet. I wrote down addresses and contact names in my careful, looping handwriting while Paulette read listings off her phone. "This one has in-suite laundry," she said. "I haven't had in-suite laundry since 2019, I said. I'd forgotten that was a thing people have. We laughed. It felt strange to laugh in that kitchen, but also necessary. I scheduled 3 viewings for the following week. I didn't tell my daughter. That night at dinner, my son-in-law talked about a problem at work, and my daughter listened. And I ate my salmon and said nothing, and thought about the notepad folded in my pocket. He didn't look at me once. He'd gotten good at that, the way you get good at not looking at something you'd rather wasn't there. After dinner, I did the dishes. I always did the dishes. Nobody had asked me to. It had just settled into the routine the way things do, when one person has more time and less claim on the space. I stood at the sink with my hands in warm water and listened to them talk in the other room, their voices low and comfortable in a way they never quite were when I was part of the conversation. I thought about my own kitchen, the one in the house Ray and I had owned for 27 years. The window above the sink that looked out onto the backyard where we'd grown tomatoes every summer. The particular way the afternoon light came through that window in September, golden and slanted, like it was trying to stay. I'd sold it for a fair price. I'd given away the tomato cages. I dried my hands and went upstairs and sat at the small desk in the guest room and opened my laptop for the first time in what felt like months. I pulled up the account information for my RRSP. The numbers were better than I'd thought, not comfortable, but workable. The savings account with Ray's money sat beside it, untouched. I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened a new browser tab and searched for tenant rights in Ontario. I didn't have a lease. I had been living here month to month, which meant I was a tenant under provincial law regardless of family arrangement. I hadn't known that. I wrote it down on the notepad. I also wrote down the name of a woman I'd heard about through a friend of Paulette's, a lawyer who specialized in estate planning and had a particular reputation for being direct. Her name was Audrey Foss. Her office was downtown, 15 minutes by bus. I booked an appointment online for the Thursday of the following week. The confirmation email came back within 5 minutes, and I sat there reading it twice, feeling something I hadn't felt in 11 months, like I was moving again, like the stillness had cracked. The apartment viewings were on Tuesday. I took the bus alone. Paulette had offered to come, but I wanted to do this part myself, to stand in the empty rooms and know whether they felt like mine without another voice in my ear. The first building was too institutional, long corridors and a front desk that felt more like a hospital than a home. The second was nicer, but on the 4th floor, and the elevator was being repaired. The third was the one near the university. A one-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor, east-facing windows, a small balcony that looked out onto a courtyard with a maple tree. The super, a quiet man named Ted, unlocked the door and stepped back to let me walk in first. The kitchen was small but had a proper window. The bedroom had a closet with double doors. The bathroom had been recently retiled in white, clean, and plain and good. The living room was nothing, just blank walls and afternoon light. I stood in the middle of it for a long time. "Take your time," Ted said, from near the door. I walked to the window and looked at the maple tree. It had just started turning. Orange at the tips, still green in the middle. "I'll take it," I said. He blinked. "You don't want to think about it?" "I've been thinking about it for 11 months, I said. "I'm done thinking." I signed the papers 2 days later. First and last month's rent, references from my previous landlord, the real estate agent who had handled my house sale, who was kind enough to write something genuine. Move-in was the 1st of the following month, 3 weeks away. I folded the copy of the lease and put it in my cardigan pocket, right on top of the notepad. I still hadn't told my daughter. Thursday came overcast, the kind of flat gray sky that sits low over the city all through November and doesn't apologize for itself. I dressed carefully. Good shoes. The wool coat I'd bought the winter before Ray died. The one he'd said made me look like I meant business. Audrey Foss's office was on the 12th floor of a glass building near King Street. Her assistant offered me tea. I took it. When Audrey came in, she was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with very direct eyes and the handshake that was firm without performing anything. I told her everything. The money Ray had left. My RRSP. The fact that I had been living for 11 months in my daughter's house without a proper arrangement or any documented understanding. The will I hadn't updated since Ray passed, which still listed my daughter as sole beneficiary. Audrey listened without interrupting. Then she asked a few careful questions. When she spoke, she was clear. Not cold, but clear. The money in your savings account is yours, completely. Your RRSP is yours. If you've made no loans or gifts to your daughter's household, nothing is owed or recoverable from that direction. She paused. The will is a different matter. You can leave your estate to anyone you choose, or to no one specific. There are organizations, women's shelters, hospice foundations, legal aid funds that accept estate gifts and use them directly. I thought about that for a moment. What would it cost to update everything? I asked. She gave me a number. It was less than I'd expected. Let's do it, I said. We spent the next hour working through it. I removed my daughter as sole beneficiary and replaced her with two organizations, a women's shelter that operated 2 locations in the city, and a hospice where Ray had spent his last 2 weeks, where the nurses had been so kind that I'd cried when we left. I named Paulette as my power of attorney for personal care. I named my accountant, a man I'd worked with for 15 years, as executor. When we were finished, Audrey printed the documents and we signed them at the small table by the window, her notary stamp making a satisfying thump on each page. You seem very settled about this, she said. I've been unsettled for almost a year, I said. This is what settled feels like. She smiled, just slightly. Call me if you need anything else. On the bus ride home, I looked out the window at the city going past, the gray sky, the streets still wet from the rain that had come through that morning. A woman at a bus stop with a red umbrella, not opening it, just holding it. I thought about the last real decision I'd made. Not a passive one, not a let things happen decision, but a real one. It had been the decision to sell the house, and even that hadn't felt entirely chosen. Everything since had been drifting. 11 months of drifting. I pressed my hand against the copy of the lease, still folded in my pocket. That evening I told my daughter. She was home before her husband that night, which I was glad for. I asked her to sit down. She looked at me with that particular wariness she'd developed recently, the one that came from knowing something was different about me, but not being able to name what. I told her I had signed a lease, that I would be moving out on the 1st of the month, 3 weeks away. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why? I held her look. I think you know why. Her face shifted. Something behind it moved. Something I recognized as guilt, and something else that might have been relief, and I felt the weight of both of those things without letting either of them change my mind. You heard us, she said. It wasn't a question either. I heard enough. She opened her mouth and I thought she was going to say she was sorry, but what came out was, he's not wrong that it's been hard, for both of us. You have to understand that. I looked at my daughter, her carefully straightened hair, her good work clothes, her hands folded on the table the way mine used to fold when I was bracing myself, and I thought about all the years I had spent making things easier for her. The 3 a.m. calls when she was in university. The time I drove 4 hours in February to be there when she had a medical scare. The way I had dismantled my entire life to come here because she'd said it made sense. I do understand, I said. And I'm still going. Her husband came home about 40 minutes later. She must have texted him because he came through the door with that particular careful expression men have when they've been warned. He didn't say much. Just nodded once when my daughter told him and went to hang up his coat, and that was that. Dinner was very quiet. I slept well. The next 3 weeks had their own kind of order to them. I packed slowly, as I had learned to do the first time. One section of the room at a time, making decisions. Anything I hadn't touched in the 11 months I'd been here went to the donation center on Bloor Street, or to the curb on bulk pickup day, or into a box marked for Paulette's church rummage sale. I was surprised by how much lighter it felt. Each box I gave away. Not loss, reduction, like getting back to the actual weight of myself. My daughter and I existed around each other carefully. She asked once if I wanted help packing. I said no, thank you, and she nodded, and that was the closest we came to a real conversation. Her husband was absent in the efficient way he had been for 11 months, except now the absence had a different quality to it. Less performance, more honesty. I didn't mind that. I'd always preferred honest absence to careful performance. Paulette came on a Saturday afternoon with a bottle of wine and no agenda. We sat in the mostly packed guest room on two folding chairs and drank wine out of plastic cups. The good glasses were already in boxes, and she asked me how I was feeling. Strange, I said. Good strange, but strange. Second thoughts? I thought about it genuinely. The way she'd said she has nowhere else to go. The way his voice had carried through the bathroom wall. The way his voice had carried through the bathroom wall. The 11 months of dishes. No, I said. I just didn't know moving could feel like putting something right. She raised her plastic cup. I raised mine. My granddaughter called the night before the move. She was 17, my daughter's oldest, and she called on her own from her own phone after bedtime. I knew because her voice was quieter than usual. Grandma, are you really leaving tomorrow? I am. Mum's upset. I know. A pause, the kind teenagers make when they're deciding how much of the truth to say. I think she's more upset that you're not upset, she said finally. Like, you're not crying or begging or anything? She keeps saying you're being dramatic, but I don't think that's what's happening. I smiled, alone in the guest room with my packed boxes and my yellow quilt folded at the foot of the bed. What do you think is happening? She considered it. I think you got tired, she said. I think you got tired in a really quiet way and nobody noticed until it was already decided. Out of the mouths of 17-year-olds. Can I come visit? She asked. The new place? I hope you will, I said. I'm going to have a proper kitchen again. I'll make you those lemon squares you like. With the icing sugar on top. With the icing sugar on top. She exhaled. Okay. Good. I'm glad you're not just disappearing. I'm not disappearing, I said. I'm just going somewhere I'm actually supposed to be. Moving day was a Saturday. 2 movers in a truck, 3 hours, done by noon. The boxes fit in the elevator. The furniture came in through the door, and when the last piece was settled, I tipped them well and stood alone in the apartment for the first time with everything in it. It was small. It was mine. The maple tree in the courtyard was fully orange now. I could see it from the kitchen window, which was the first thing I checked when I was unpacking. I put the kettle on and stood watching the tree while it boiled. I made tea in my own mug. I drank it at my own table. The boxes took 3 days to unpack properly. I was in no hurry. I hung what mattered, donated what didn't, and left a few walls bare because I decided I wanted to choose slowly and carefully, and only put up things I genuinely loved. The yellow quilt went on the bed. Ray's photograph went on the bookshelf in the living room. My books went where I could reach them. On the 4th day, I called my bank. I had kept my accounts at the same branch since 1988, and I'd been letting the paper statements go to my daughter's address since the move. I updated the address first, then asked to review the account in full with an advisor. A woman named Teresa, brisk, competent, no wasted words, walked me through everything. I moved the savings from the old account into a new one. I set up automatic transfers to a TFSA I hadn't been using. You'd like to set up an estate naming as well? Teresa asked. Yes, I've already updated my will, but I want the accounts to reflect the same beneficiaries. She nodded and pulled up the forms. When I left the bank, the sky had cleared. That particular clean November blue that shows up sometimes after weeks of gray, like the sky apologizing. I walked to the grocery store on the corner and bought soup vegetables and a small bunch of tulips and a bag of lemon drops because I'd wanted them and hadn't bought them in a long time. On Sunday, I had Paulette over for the first time. She brought scones from the bakery on Dundas Street, and I made a proper pot of tea, and we sat at the table by the window with the maple tree outside, mostly bare now, just a few orange leaves still holding on. This suits you, she said. I know, I said. That's the strange part. I forgot what suiting myself felt like. She picked up a scone. How long do you think before your daughter calls? She texted yesterday, I said. She wanted to know if I was all right. What did you say? I said yes. Paulette nodded. And are you? I looked at the window. The maple tree. The good light. I'm better than all right, I said. I'm back. She came the following Saturday. My daughter. Alone, without her husband, which I thought was probably intentional on her part and which I appreciated. She knocked and waited on the doorstep, which she had never done at her own house when I lived there, and I noticed that and filed it away. I let her in. I made tea. We sat at the table. She looked at the apartment the way people look at something when they're trying to figure out how to feel about it. Her eyes moved over the bookshelf, Ray's photograph, the quilt through the bedroom doorway. "It's nice," she said. "Small." "Enough," I said. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "I think I owe you an apology." I waited. What Nathan said. She stopped. What we both said, really. I didn't tell him to stop. I should have. You should have, I agreed. She looked up. She'd expected more of a fight, I could see that. The agreement seemed to cost her more than an argument would have. "I didn't realize you felt you didn't ask," I said, not cruelly, just plainly. "You asked me to come and I came, and then neither of you asked me very much of anything after that." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were fine." "I was managing," I said. "There's a difference." She set down her mug. "I don't want you to think that I didn't." She stopped again. "That I don't. I know you love me," I said. "That's not what this was about." The tears that came were real, and I handed her a paper napkin from the holder on the table, and I didn't fill the silence the way I used to, the way I had done for 40 years, rushing in to ease the discomfort, to say it's fine, to close the distance. I let her feel it. After a while, she said, "Can we try? Being in contact, I mean. Properly." "I'd like that," I said. "On different terms." "Different how?" "Terms where I'm a person, not an arrangement." She nodded slowly, like something was settling, like a weight she'd been holding without knowing was finally being named. We talked for another hour, about her work, which I hadn't really known much about my granddaughter, who had apparently told her parents that she thought the move was good for me, which had gone over about as well as you'd expect, about a trip my daughter and her husband were considering, and the fact that she'd signed up for a pottery class and hadn't told anyone yet because she wasn't sure she'd be any good. I didn't know she liked pottery. I told her about the apartment, the maple tree, the lemon drops I'd bought myself, the tulips that were blooming on the windowsill in the kitchen. When she left, she hugged me at the door in a way that felt different from the hugs in the last 11 months, which had been the hugs of two people performing closeness. This was just her arms around me and my arms around her, and neither of us saying anything. I watched her walk to her car. She didn't look back. I didn't expect her to. But she drove away slowly, which I thought meant something. That evening, my granddaughter texted. She came over the following weekend with her school bag and 3 problems she wanted to talk through. One about a friend, one about a teacher, and one about whether she should apply to a university in Halifax when all her friends were staying in Ontario. We sat at the kitchen table and worked through all 3 over lemon squares and tea, and she left with 2 decisions made and 1 still open and the remainder of the lemon squares wrapped in foil. "Same time next week?" she asked at the door. "Same time next week," I said. Paulette organized a small gathering for the following Sunday. Just 4 of us. Paulette, her friend Beverly from her book club, a woman I'd known peripherally for years, named Carol, who had recently retired from teaching and seemed very relieved about it, and me. We sat in my small living room with wine and crackers and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. At one point, Beverly said something about a book she'd read, about a woman who'd spent decades in a marriage where she was present but not seen, and how strange it had been to read it and think, yes, I know exactly what that is. It's a particular kind of loneliness, Carol said, being around people who don't quite know you're there. I thought about the kitchen table at my daughter's house, the 11 months. The dishes. Yes, I said, it is. We opened a second bottle of wine. December came, and with it, the kind of cold that settles into everything. Frost on the courtyard windows, the maple tree bare and pale against the gray sky, the sidewalks requiring careful walking. I didn't mind it. I'd always been a winter person, in the way that meant I liked having a good reason to stay inside with a book and a pot of something warm. I baked. More than I had in years, because I had a kitchen that was mine and time that was mine and no sense that the smell of cinnamon or bread was an imposition on someone else's space. I baked the lemon squares twice, and a batch of shortbread I hadn't made since Ray was alive, and a honey cake from a recipe my mother had written in her cramped handwriting on an index card that had survived 3 moves. I mailed a portion of the honey cake to my son-in-law's mother, who lived in Kitchener and whom I'd always liked. She called to thank me, and we talked for 40 minutes, and she told me she was glad I'd moved somewhere of my own. I hadn't told her the details. She was sharp enough not to need them. The week before Christmas, I received a letter from Audrey Foss's office confirming that all estate documents had been filed and were on record. The will was updated. The accounts were designated. The power of attorney was in place. I stood in the kitchen holding the letter and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but solidity. Like standing on ground that was actually ground and not just something that looked like it. I filed the letter in the small fireproof box I kept in the bedroom closet. Beside it sat Ray's last letter to me, the one he'd written when he was in the hospice, knowing the odds. I hadn't read it in several months. That night I took it out and read it again. "You always did too much for everyone else," he had written in his careful engineer's handwriting. That's not a criticism. It was one of the things I loved most. But don't let it mean you forget to do things for yourself. You deserve more room than you've been giving yourself. I hadn't known what he meant when I read it the first time. I thought I knew what he meant now. Christmas was quiet. My granddaughter came on the 23rd, just her, with a small wrapped package and a lot of opinions about the holiday playlist I was playing. We exchanged gifts and ate shortbread, and she tried, unsuccessfully, to teach me a card game that seemed to involve a great deal of shouting. My daughter and her husband came on Christmas afternoon. Nathan, my son-in-law, sat in my small living room and looked at the apartment with the expression of a man who is trying to be at ease and finding it harder than expected. He said the apartment was nice. He said it twice. I said thank you both times and offered him more tea. It wasn't repaired, but it was honest, which is sometimes a better starting place. January brought a new quiet. My granddaughter started coming over on Tuesday afternoons to do homework, which meant a significant quantity of tutoring and also a significant quantity of her telling me about the complicated social ecology of grade 12. I kept the lemon squares stocked. I joined the library's Thursday afternoon reading group, which had old members and very strong feelings about character development, and I looked forward to it more than I'd expected to. I started a container garden on the balcony, just herbs to start. Thyme, parsley, a stubborn little rosemary that kept threatening to die and then didn't. The super told me the previous tenant had tried to grow tomatoes and that it was possible, facing east, if I was patient. I bought tomato seeds in February. Paulette and I walked every Wednesday morning, rain or cold or the occasional early thaw that lied about spring. We talked about everything and nothing, which is the only way to actually talk about the things that matter. One Wednesday in February, she said, "You seem different from 6 months ago." Different how? She thought about it, like you're in your own life again, like you moved back into yourself. I thought about the guest room, the yellow quilt on someone else's bed, the kitchen table where I'd sat for 11 months and felt like an inconvenience with good manners. "I did," I said. "I think that's exactly what happened." We walked past the library, past the coffee shop where we sometimes stopped, past the small park with the bare trees and the pigeons who had strong opinions about bread. I had no idea what came next. There were things I wanted to do. The tomatoes, the reading group, the tutoring of grade 12 social dynamics. And there were things I hadn't thought of yet, which was perhaps the best part, the not yet thought of things. Ray used to say that the most interesting part of any project was before you knew how it ended. I'd always disagreed with him, being a person who liked knowing, but standing here now, in February, with a whole quiet year ahead of me, I thought he might have had a point. I am 68 years old, and I live in my own apartment with a maple tree outside the window and tomato seeds on the kitchen counter, and a granddaughter who comes on Tuesdays, and a best friend who walks with me on Wednesdays. I set my own table. I answer to my own name. I sleep without listening for footsteps in the hall or waiting for the house to grow quiet enough to feel like I belong in it. I don't know what I gave away too easily in those 11 months. My confidence, maybe. My habit of taking up space, but I know what I brought with me when I left. The yellow quilt, Ray's photograph, the honey cake recipe in my mother's handwriting, and the knowledge that it is never too late to go somewhere you are actually supposed to be. That's not nothing. At 68, in January, with a whole year ahead and the tomatoes not yet planted, that is, in fact, everything. I think about the 11 months a lot, not with bitterness, that's not quite the right word for it anymore, but with the particular clarity that comes after you've finally done the thing you should have done much sooner. 11 months of folding myself smaller. 11 months of doing the dishes because it gave me something to do with my hands while I figured out how to be invisible in a way that didn't inconvenience anyone. What I understand now, looking back, is that what happened in that house wasn't cruelty so much as carelessness. My daughter loved me. She just hadn't thought carefully about what it meant to invite me into her life, and I hadn't thought carefully enough about what I was agreeing to. We were both operating on assumption instead of truth, and assumptions left unexamined have a way of becoming the air you breathe. Thin, insufficient, nobody quite sure when it started going wrong. That's what I mean when I think about acting rightly. Not grand gestures, not dramatic confrontations, just the small daily practice of treating people, including yourself, as though they actually matter. My son-in-law wasn't a villain. He was a man who had never been asked to examine his own comfort, and so he didn't. My daughter wasn't unkind. She was a woman who had learned that her mother would manage, and so she let me. And I had spent a lifetime being someone who managed, who made do, who waited for an invitation that kept not arriving. The morning I wrote those 3 words on my notepad, bank, lawyer, apartment, was the morning I started thinking clearly again. Not emotionally, not reactively, but clearly. There's a kind of intelligence in that, I've come to believe, not cleverness, something quieter. The ability to look at a situation honestly, without the distortion of what you wish it were, and ask, what does this actually require? What is actually true here? I hadn't been asking those questions. I'd been asking softer ones, easier ones, the ones with answers I could live with without changing anything. And then there was the question of whether I had the steadiness to follow through once I'd seen it clearly. That was the harder part. Not the lawyer's appointment, not the lease signing, not even the conversation with my daughter at my own kitchen table. The harder part was the quiet internal work of not talking myself back into the old arrangement. Every familiar thing pulls at you. The yellow quilt on their guest bed, the coffee I'd been making in their kitchen for 11 months, the idea of my daughter's face when I told her. I knew all of that, and I did it anyway. Not because I was certain it would work out, because staying had stopped being something I could do with any honesty left in me. What I keep coming back to is this, the life I have now. The maple tree, Tuesdays with my granddaughter, the tomato seeds on the kitchen counter. None of it appeared because things went well for me. It appeared because I was finally willing to do the uncomfortable, necessary thing. Cause and effect. Not punishment, not reward. Just the plain logic of how things actually work. You live honestly. You act on what you know to be true. You find the steadiness to see it through. And the life that follows is the one that actually fits. Ray knew that about me before I did. He wrote it in that letter. More room than you've been given yourself. I'm giving myself the room now. Turns out it was here the whole time, waiting for me to show up and take it.